Welcome to the Andrew Carnegie Fellows Forums. Today, we will be discussing racism in America, its intersection with protests and policing, and movements for change with leading scholars. This is the first in a series of 3 Andrew Carnegie Fellows Forums taking place this summer. We will be highlighting the contributions of our fellows, whose scholarly research in the humanities and social sciences addresses important issues confronting our society. The $200,000 fellowships enable recipients to devote their time to significant research and writing. Check out their projects on our website, carnegie.org. Join us live on Facebook and YouTube. We will also be live tweeting. Follow us at Carnegie Corp, hashtag Carnegie Fellows. Towards the end of the discussion, we will be taking your questions. Our host is Alondra Nelson, President of the Social Science Research Council. Please welcome Alondra Nelson.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for being here. I'm Alondra Nelson, President of the SSRC and also the Harold F. Linder Professor at the Institute for Advanced Study. I am a sociologist of science, technology, and social inequality, and my research explores these intersections. And a recent book called The Social Life of DNA, which is an ethnographic book that explored how social life is being transformed by direct-to-consumer genetic ancestry testing and racial politics in the US in particular. My book, Body and Soul, The Black Panther Party and the Fight Against Medical Discrimination, is actually open access through the summer as part of the University of Minnesota Press's Reading for Social Justice collection. This book was also featured on a recent recommended reading list about systemic racism on NPR and also recommended by the New York Public Library Schomburg Center. So I hope that you will find some guidance there for these times that might be of interest. So I'm here today with a third hat, and that hat is having had the great pleasure and honor of having been a member of the Carnegie Fellows Program jury since 2018. The Carnegie Fellows Program was founded through the great vision of Carnegie Corporation President Vartan Gregorian in 2015 to specifically support scholarship in the social sciences and humanities. The program is now in its 6th class of fellows, and there are currently 192 fellows and alumni. The Carnegie Corporation has a long history of supporting individual scholarship. More recently, between 2000 and 2009, the corporation awarded over 100 fellowships to experts on Islam and in the Muslim world. And then I have the great benefit at the SSRC of working on a program with the Carnegie Corporation that's quite literally funded hundreds of scholars on the African continent and the social sciences and humanities. So the jury has been an extraordinary experience. I mean, it's been really a labor of love. It's been exciting to be able to have access to some of the best scholars in the social sciences and humanities who are coming to the table with their most interesting and exciting work. I mean, the fellowship really asks scholars, if given this great opportunity, what transformative work would you do? And so to have the opportunity to read with a group of colleagues over the course of 2 days and deliberate and anguish over some excellent work has just been a tremendous opportunity that both allows one to help to the corporation to decide to support great work, but also in total gives you an extraordinary vision of the richness of social science and humanistic research that's happening right now. And that's helping us to really have a better sense of our work and the world. And it's really in a tremendous value. It shows the tremendous value of supporting the social sciences and humanities. And so it gives me, great honor to be able to be joined today by 3 of our Andrew Carnegie Fellows, all outstanding scholars in their own right, and all of them doing really transformative work, not only in their own disciplines, but arguably to really transform the social sciences and what social science research should be doing and should look like if it's truly to meet this moment. So first, I want to introduce Dr. Daniel Gillian. Professor Gillian is the Julie Baron Platt and Marky Platt Presidential Distinguished Professor of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania. He is an expert on racial and ethnic politics, protests and support of social movements, and how those movements shape public opinion and influence elections. He is the author of Loud Minority: Why Protests Matter and American Democracy, which came out earlier this year. He also has written 2 award-winning books, Governing with Words and The Political Power of Protest, Minority Activism and Shifts in Public Policy. Please welcome Professor Daniel Gillian.
Hello, thank you for having me here today. It's good to be here.
It's great to have you here. Thank you. Dr. Leif Mullings is a distinguished professor emerita at the City University of New York's Graduate Center. She is an expert on manifestations of racism and how Black and Indigenous people are organizing to combat new forms of discrimination. Professor Mullings is the former president of the American Anthropological Association and a contributor to the Anti-Racist Research and Action Network's collaborative project, Black and Indigenous Resistance in the Americas, From Multiculturalism to Racist Backlash. Please welcome Professor Leif Mullings.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Professor Mullings. Dr. Lawrence Ralph is a professor of anthropology at Princeton University. He is an expert on policing, race, and the limits of democracy, and today's nationwide protests as compared to those of 6 years ago after the killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. He is the author of The Torture Letters: Reckoning with Police Violence, published in January of this year, as well as the director and narrator of an animated documentary by the same name, published in the New York Times just last week. Please welcome Professor Lawrence Ralph.
Thank you. Great to be here.
So it's great to see you all, and kudos to the Carnegie Fellows program for having the vision to support such extraordinary work and work that really is pushing the boundaries of what social science research can be and do in the world and humanities research. So I want to begin by placing us all in the current moment and asking you to reflect a bit on that. So we're all familiar, either by having seen it or heard about a horrific video of a white police officer killing an unarmed Black man, George Floyd, an incident that has ignited weeks of protest across the country and indeed around the world. The Black Lives Matter movement has sparked a national discussion about police violence and the fact that it disproportionately falls on on people of color, and to put a finer point on it, on Black people, and the fact that and why there is a continued impunity for police officers who continue to commit wrongdoing. However, the case of George Floyd is not unique. There have been prior instances for generations in the United States of extrajudicial police killings. So many are wondering, all of us are wondering, why might this time be different? And why might these protests and the sort of public reckoning we're having around police violence result in lasting change? So I invite each of you to weigh in on that based on your work. And I'll start with you, Daniel. What do you make of this moment, and will it lead to lasting change?
Thanks for that question. There's no doubt that when you watch that video of George Floyd laying on the ground with the officer's knee on his neck, you feel something deep down inside. I mean, if you don't feel anything, you have nothing inside you. I sat and watched that actually with my 2 boys, 11-year-old and 12-year-old, and they were just heartbroken looking at that particular situation. They moved from being sad to just being absolutely angry at the little iPad that we were watching. And so it is a heart-wrenching moment. And some would say that was the catalyst of the movement. I tend to view it as a crescendo of other protests that have occurred, to the point where now individuals were just fed up. And we saw those frustrations pour out into the streets with thousands of individuals protesting. And what was different about this particular protest event? Well, we saw thousands of individuals going out on the street, but it was more contentious, it was more raw, it was more real. And it also led to protests throughout the nation, in every corner of America, even internationally. We saw protests in Berlin and protests in Toronto, Canada. It led to more buy-in as well You had many individuals, as I attended various protests around the nation, that did not look like me, other races and other groups joining in. And I think that that is going to lead to change not only in society, but change in politics and in policy. And so I think we're expecting much change to come in the future.
Thank you for that, Daniel. Leith, what would you say? I mean, about lasting change. So Daniel offers that it wasn't a catalyst; it was a crescendo. We certainly know from your work and other work that these things have been happening for a very long time. And so, why might this time, if you think it might, lead to change?
Well, I agree with Daniel that people actually seeing on video the torture and execution of a man calling for his mother was very startling for many people. I think that the context that we're in now in the United States, the fact of the increasing inequality, the COVID pandemic, the fact that there's no trust in authorities, the corruption of the Trump administration also created a specific atmosphere. But what I would also say is that, as Daniel said, this is part of the long Black freedom struggle that has been going on for centuries. And this is the most recent iteration. But let's remember that that in 2015, we really had the consolidation of the movement for Black Lives. And I became part of a 7-country study to study racism and resistance in the US and 6 other countries in Latin America. And while people wondered what had happened to the Black Lives Movement, the Black Lives Movement was very active from the time it consolidated in 2015. They had various tactics. They had direct action. They had legislative action. They had political education. They spanned out into many areas of the country. They had many victories, particularly in Chicago and in Ohio, getting the prosecutor McGinty, who had not well prosecuted the Tamir Rice, thrown out, all kinds of changes in Chicago, so that in fact they were, by August 2016, they had produced a magnificent document, the Vision for Black Lives. So they have been working all of this time. So although many of the participants were a result of spontaneous participation, this work has been going on and continues to go on.
Thank you, Leith, and thank you for that reminder that movement work continues, whether or not it's it's under a spotlight, and that people continue to do the work. Lawrence, how would you weigh in on change that's happening or might be happening now?
I agree with everything that's been said already. I just want to highlight a couple key points in the cultural realm of things. I think that the word crescendo that Daniel used is very apt, because not only has organizing been happening this whole time, other instances of violence have been happening this whole time as well. And so, we have the Sandra Bland's, the Rekia Boyds, the Laquan McDonald's. And so we had a kind of a trickle of these incidents occurring, and we had the awareness in the public that it was occurring. And so the public wasn't able to forget that police violence was an issue in America. I think that the rawness and the seemingly egregiousness of the Floyd instance in particular it caught everyone's attention, partly because we're in the midst of a pandemic. The pandemic affected it because everybody's attuned to what's going on in social media. They have the key focus attention and the lack of distractions that we may typically have in our routine as Americans. But also, I think the pandemic allows us to see some of the failures that Leaf was just describing with the Trump administration and with the governmental. I think failure is not a strong enough term, but the fact that maybe willful neglect is the better term. The fact that we can't get COVID tests, we can't get, we have no idea when the pandemic's going to end. And it really brings to the fore the fact that we are all connected as a society, and the violences that one person faces can literally affect anyone. And when it connects to police violence, it's the issue that Black people have known all along for centuries, is that you can be a victim of police violence and it cannot be your fault. You can just be walking down the street and you can become a victim of police violence. And with COVID, I think a lot of other Americans learned that they can be the victim of a deadly infectious disease and it cannot be their fault. They could be a good person. They could be doing the right thing. And they could be succumbed by this disease. And so in the midst of that vulnerability, that shared vulnerability that we're all experiencing as a nation, we see this horrific event. And I think that's part of the reason why we have one of the most diverse coalitions of people seeking real social transformation at this moment.
Thank you for that. And thank you for reminding us of, I think two things to highlight out of the conversation thus far. One from Professor Mullings and Gillian, the sort of movement work that is always ongoing, that long Black freedom tradition that continues things forward. And then, Professor Ralph reminding us really of the priming function or the inflection point of the pandemic. I mean, I think it'll take future Carnegie Fellows and scholars to kind of, I think, look back in time and see where externalities sort of created the conditions of possibility for movements to take on new and powerful form. So thank you for that, for getting us started. So what was distinctive, of course, about the Sandra Bland experience, and of course about the George Floyd experience, and others, of course, was the video. This video that we now know was taken by a 17-year-old girl who showed great courage to her personal safety, and also just, I think, great sort of discernment and sort of a sense of the sort of tragedy and history of the moment in some ways. What would you say, each of you, about the role of citizen videos and citizen witness and its potential impact on police reform? So we could talk about literal technologies, but there's other forms in which citizens come together to sort of give testimony and bear witness, and I'd welcome your reflections on that. Daniel, we'll start with you.
It's vital in this age for individuals to not only bear witness, but to record these experiences. Gone are the days where individuals see injustice occurring right in front of their face, and they continue to walk on by, and they continue to move along. Now you have these cameras and on telephones, on mobile devices, that allows it to be very easy to record interactions with police and other individuals of authority. And it matters greatly because once you have that video evidence, then it's hard to dispute that an injustice has occurred. And having the video evidence isn't to say that injustices haven't been occurring. There have been injustices over decades, centuries in the Black community. But now when it's right in front of you, now when you have no choice but to watch it through the television screen, it makes it real to those individuals that might have doubted that this sort of racial discrimination was occurring. So I believe it's vital.
Thank you. Leif, you recently wrote a piece in the Boston Review, The Fire This Time, which takes up James Baldwin's, obviously, a great book of that title, which reflects on some of this. Would you say a few words about that?
I would say that the whole issue of social media has changed many things and transformed many things. Social media has many functions. It creates community. It can disseminate evidence, and it can help people organize around evidence. And what's been interesting to me in this last iteration of protests is that the media is no longer speaking in one voice, although maybe I only watch MSNBC. But in fact, because they were there in the protests and in fact were filming what was happening, you didn't get the usual conclusion that these are looters and disorderly people. You in fact got actual video of the police brutally attacking, in many cases, the protesters. And so all that I think is quite important. Now, the videos themselves, however, are not the end all and be all. The videos produce evidence, but what you need after that is people being able to take this evidence and bring about change. And that's where they run into the institutional issues of the prosecutors who won't prosecute, the juries that will not convict. And that's where you need, you have the evidence, but then you need the organization around the evidence. But the evidence in and of itself is quite important.
So, Lawrence, what would you say? I would appreciate your thoughts on either kind of social media technology and the role of that, particularly as someone who uses increasingly the media and your work. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think Daniel gestured to the fact that a younger generation has a fluency with the media, and it's a part of their everyday lives, and so that when you're so used to recording yourselves and recording what's going on, you're also primed to record an injustice and not just walk past it. And I think that this attunement really gets to what Leith was saying in terms of the limits of video footage. I mean, I think if we think of the juxtaposition between this, 17-year-old Black teenager filming that and the craze that was body cam footage that happened after Ferguson with Obama's 21st century policing mandate, when every police department in the United States was then supposed to have body cams and that was supposed to be some sort of panacea. We see like the limits of outmoded ideas of reform. And so it still takes that person being aware and allowing us to see through our own eyes an injustice in the street that brings about a kind of radical change. And I think that we need to, as Leith is saying, follow this through with all the tools and resources that we have to really bring about justice and bring about change.
And certainly also political will. I mean, in each of your work, you marshal evidence, and arguably, the social sciences of race and racism and inequality have been marshaling evidence and bearing witness to this for generations. And so it's not for lack of having the data that we haven't known of the existence, of these things. Where we can go back to Ida B. Wells' The Red Record, through Michael Brown, Rekia Boyd and the like. So we've known, and it's a question about, do we really want to know, and do we want to act on it? So one of the sort of, I think, changes that's starting to emerge out of this moment is a real conversation about the role of policing and policing as an institution, and forms of policing across different institutions. Across the country, activists and protesters are calling on government leaders to defund, to downsize, to abolish police departments. Those of us who study social movements are used to the language of abolishment and used to the language of defunding, but it's really become part of mainstream discourse as a real possibility, a real imagination about what might happen with policing. Some cities have begun to take steps in this direction. So in Minneapolis, a veto-proof majority of the city council pledged to dismantle their police force. Remains to, we'll have to see what happens there. In New York City, the New York City Council passed a budget which they say will reduce the New York City Police Department's budget by $1 billion. So, what do you think about these promises from the state? What might be the ramifications of this movement, and how far do you think it will go in the end? Let's start with you, Daniel.
I'm actually really interested to hear what Dr. Ralph has to say about this. I mean, but in looking at the change in policies and police departments, we've seen a lot of movement. We've seen individuals or police departments lose funding. We've seen representatives talk about what role police departments should play in various events and activities. So we've seen a lot of change. Individuals are reconsidering what role should police officers play in various communities. And so I think that the policy shift is inevitable, and it's taking place at the local level, but we're also seeing it in Congress. Congress is having discussions about whether or not military equipment should be then given to police departments for them to use that. And so there is much change taking place across the nation, but I'm really interested to hear what Dr. Ralph has to say about this.
Dr. Ralph, what do you have to say?
Well, I think that similar to what Leith was saying earlier, the just as the kind of movement for Black Lives has been going on really strongly, organizing under the radar since 2015, the abolition movement, the movement to defund police departments, has been doing work really intimately on the ground in major American cities for decades. And part of what is happening is what Daniel gestured towards, which is an idea to reprioritize how we think about public safety in this country. And so for many Americans, policing itself it entails violence. Enforcement entails violence. We have to recall that the police are the enforcement angle of the law. And so when they're called in, the weapons that they have, the tactics that they use, automatically create force and create danger. So how do we think of public safety without force is the question. And so what defunding means is investing in schools, investing in hospitals. And the argument is that when we invest in those other kinds of public safety initiatives, we automatically reduce crime. We automatically reduce the kinds of things that police are called for, but not equipped to handle. And so I think that the funding movement is very important. And the question is, what is the best strategy? Do we go at a local level to try to enact change that's happening in places like Minneapolis and New York City? Or can we kind of enlist the public will at a federal level to enact the same sort of transformation in the name of public safety?
Thank you for that. Dr. Mullings, would you like to weigh in on this question?
Yes, I agree with all that's been said. I think it's important to look not only at the disinvestment in the police angle, but also, as Ralph was saying, in the reinvestment. What is it that people want to be the money from police to be invested in. And that's where I think things make a difference. Now, the Movement for Black Lives has in 2 weeks, which I think is remarkable, produced a bill that they are submitting to Congress called the Breathe Bill. And what they say is that it has several features, 4 features, which I'll read. Divesting federal resources from incarceration and policing, investing in new approaches to community safety, allocating new money to build healthy, sustainable, and equitable communities for all police, holding officials accountable, and enhancing self-determination of Black communities. So in other words, you can't have one without the other. And so what they're talking about is a process where you disinvest in what has been very harmful to us, and you invest in things that will in fact benefit the society as a whole.
I'm really struck by your sort of laying out the process, and also thinking about a moment, sort of 5 or 7 years ago when, as a society, we began to wake up to the problem of mass incarceration. And I think it's sort of really important to understand this moment as a real success of that conversation, of Michelle Alexander really helping us to understand about the new Jim Crow and how that carries through. So thank you for helping us to think about the process in another way. So I want to pause to remind those of us who are joining us on video that the Andrew Carnegie Fellows Forum series will be taking questions at the end of the session, and we'll be answering your questions. So please keep them coming in via Facebook or YouTube, or you can email us and perhaps even use the hashtag. So let's turn to public opinion, which I think, which for me has been sort of shocking to see. We know that, when movements succeed, whether or not they're movements we support or don't support, they take people with them. They sort of make things that seemed impossible, ideas that seemed outrageous, outlandish, defund the police, abolish prisons, actually seem like well in the realm of possibility, and moreover, I think when movement framings are successful, inevitable. Like, of course, this should be the next move that should be happening, and the polis and the political sphere. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how social movements like Black Lives Matter influence public opinion. And I want to just bring up a study that I think some of you will have seen. According to a study last month by the Pew Research Center, most Americans support the Black Lives Matter movement. In the past 2 years, moreover, and this is a study by the New York Times, that we've seen a dramatic increase in support for the movement for Black lives. I mean, that increase is, to Lawrence's point, I mean, that is parallels. You could probably superimpose it with some of the COVID-19 maps, infection rate maps. I mean, it is a dramatic change in opinion, and these things might be related, but it remains to be studied to see. So how do you think this recent change in public opinion amongst most Americans will influence the 2020 election? So we'll turn to Professor Gillian, our political scientist, first on this one.
Well, when you look at public opinion, it is really intriguing to see the trend over time. I mean, if you go back to 2016, the vitriol that was put on Black Lives Matter was immense. I mean, to the point where you had individuals like Rudy Giuliani and other conservatives saying that it was racist to utter those words, which was absolutely shocking. And so what we've seen now in 2020 is a shift towards legitimizing the group in the claim that's being put forth, that Black Lives Matter, they do matter, and that individuals who are out protesting for rights, they have a legitimate right, a legitimate concern. So we've seen right now a buy-in. We've seen individuals legitimize the cause, and as a consequence, public opinion will shift in regards to the concerns that the protesters are putting forth, that Black Lives Matter is putting forth. And so that's important. Now, how will it affect elections? Well, we can expect immense change come November. Sometimes when you look at protests, we might think of protesters as being the only individuals who are out engaging, and there's no one else who really cares about this issue because the people who are at home aren't protesting. We saw Donald Trump try and tap into this with the notions of the silent majority. And we've seen the notion of the silent majority before with with Nixon. We saw that Trump tried to go into the Nixon playbook, trying to, I guess, allow Americans to stand on different sides of the political aisle, hoping that he'll get some sort of electoral gain. But the reality is that when protest occurs, it leads individuals to engage in electoral politics. Individuals on the liberal side who support protests are more likely to contribute campaign dollars. Individuals are more likely to turn out, and Democrats who support protesters are more likely to gain support and more likely to win. So protest has a rippling effect on the electoral process. And if history is any judge, then we should expect not only a blue wave, but a blue tsunami coming in October.
So first the crescendo, now the tsunami. There's a lot of kind of motion and big waves with Dr. Gilliam. Thank you very much for that. So Daniel's given us very much a political scientist perspective on public opinion and social change. We have with us, of course, two very eminent anthropologists as well. And I don't think either of you use public opinion data in your work, but how would you interpret through your lens as scholars, as anthropologists, this sort of relationship that we might want to talk about between public opinion, some might call it culture or not, a very thin model of culture, and what might happen in electoral politics and come November in the fall. Let's go to you, Professor Mullings.
Well, that's an interesting question because public opinion shifts rapidly. And I was amazed to see in the New York Times that they refer to this protest as the largest protest in the United States in recent history, with some 20-something million participating in different ways and in many different places. I think that's an indication of something. But I think to go back to what I said earlier, the way people react has a great deal to do with their own circumstances. And I'm really happy, for example, to see so many young people in this. Most of them, I believe, are under 35, although I think older people also have something to contribute. But I think they cannot see their futures. I think the inequality, the corporate greed, the destruction of the planet has really, the COVID pandemic has really created a situation which makes it difficult, which makes people much more open to protesting the society as it is and thinking about other ways that it can go. Now, needless to say, certain forces will do their best to undercut this. And so I think what we saw, for example, in the last election is that the blame for all of the ills of society was placed on people of color. And that has happened historically with respect to white privilege in the United States. What makes this different? I think what makes this a different situation is really the intensity of the worldwide dysfunction, inequality, the complete, the ridiculous issues with foreign policy, and then the rise of patriarchy and misogyny. And I think everybody feels this. Now, there will be an attempt, as I said, to turn that in another direction. But to the extent that it doesn't, it could change the way the political system looks. But I have to add that, should Biden win, he will have to be really pushed on many of these issues. And so the movement will have to continue. The movement will, I think, have more space to grow under these circumstances, but it really has to continue.
Thank you. Professor Ralph?
Yeah, just building on some of those thoughts, I think that particularly when it comes to public opinion, there's always this discrepancy between where the public is in thinking about issues and where, Congress is, where lawmakers are and policies makers are, particularly when it comes to issues like the guns in our society or something like that, where most Americans feel that there needs to be a drastic change. And yet there's lobbyists and politicians at a stalemate on some of these issues. And I think that's where the question of generation is coming to the fore. I mean, just in my own career as a professor, I've seen this transformation in students who've experienced Occupy Wall Street and school shootings and not able to get jobs, and now pandemic, and not able to afford school. And so the old playbook of divide and conquer by using racism is not working in the same way, because people understand that their lives are impacted too, which goes back to the question that we were discussing earlier. Why are all these diverse coalition and a lot of white people organizing under the banner now of Black Lives Matter? And I think that is precisely because of the idea that, and the realization, particularly among a younger generation, that everybody is impacted by state violence, and the unwillingness to accept that for any of us. And this flies in the face of the multiculturalism that has dominated politics for generations. And so I think that in this moment, when it comes to public opinion, the challenge is to harness the public will that is being stirred up and is being really called to action to really move these calcified structures that have been in place precisely to stall and stop radical transformation.
Can I
Thank
also
you for that. And let's pick up on thinking about the sort of what racism is in this moment. So, we social scientists and humanists of race, we've got lots of theories, and maybe too many theories, right? We've got, Larry Bobo's laissez-faire racism. We've got Bonilla Silva, racism without racists. One read on Kimberly Crenshaw's intersectionality is a theory of racism. What does racism in America look like today if Professor Ralph is correct that we've had to throw out the old playbook? There are new allies and solidarities, but there's still persistent problems. Is it different than it used to be? How, in your scholarship and in your thinking, are you trying to characterize this moment? So let's start with you, Dr. Mullings.
Well, I think that one has to look at it historically, and that if we look at the U.S., the U.S. has been through several different phases of racism. And let me just make clear what I mean by race is a relationship, and it's a relationship of dispossession and oppression, dispossession of one group, of the labor, of the land, the lives of other groups, and they are then created as racialized people. So in other words, it doesn't exist by itself. It is created through a relationship of oppression. So I think we've had different relationships throughout history. You had slavery, you had segregation and Jim Crow. Then you had the civil rights movement. And that's where then all of the theories you mentioned, Alondra, come into being, because then what you have is a worldview that suggests that, in fact, the civil rights movement has solved everything, and so these people are actually, getting more than they should get, and so we refer to that as colorblind racism. In other words, everything is fine, despite the incredible evidence that everything is not fine. For example, although there was some progress made through the 70s, recently, if you look at the wage gap between blacks and whites, it is the gap is back where it was in the 50s as a result of a whole series of policies. And the ink was hardly dry on some of the civil rights bills, and that where we were guaranteed legal rights before people started tearing them down. And I mention that because I think there are many similarities in other countries. And so you did get this kind of worldview that everything is fine. And that then laid the foundation for what I would call revanchist racism, and symbolized in the election of Donald Trump, although that trend has certainly existed all along. But then it was public, it was accepted, and it represented actually an attempt to take back resources and to reoppress people in ways that had not been the case. Now, what has happened very recently is that there has been a reaction to that. And that's what we're seeing now. And that takes new form, that requires new forms of resistance. And those are the things I think we have as scholars the responsibility to look at. What kinds of modes of resistance are necessary with this new form of racism, and how do we share our scholarship with activists to move things forward?
Thank you for that. So, Lawrence, in your recent work and with your recent book, the Torture Letters, you've been, I think we'll see what you think about this, working through a new theory of race, which uses new modalities for kind of articulating to wider publics what race and racism are. And most recently, you've done a video project with the New York Times that I wanted to share a bit with folks and then get your comments on.
Great. Yes. I mean, I think that what I've been focusing on is, racial disparities and how we can see just the social inequality by looking at our most marginalized in society, and and because of the histories that Leith is mentioning, they map on to people who have been historically and systematically oppressed. And so I think that, again, if we kind of focus our energy on fixing the world for the most marginalized, then it will impact the rest of America. But we just have to have the buy-in to realize that those problems are connected to us all.
Thank you. So we're going to show a little clip of the video, and then we're going to go to Q&A. And that, Lawrence, if you could say a few words as we move into discussion, that would be great. So play the video, please.
In West Cermak Road. It's been more than a decade. I know you're much older now, and yet, when I see Black and brown teenagers of today's Chicago, I always return to that scene. 4 police cars were parked along the curb. 6 officers patted you down. Your bags were both white, each with a different word airbrushed in graffiti letters. Your names, I assumed, though I couldn't make them out from where I stood. I had moved to Chicago 2 weeks prior to this incident, and it scared me for 2 reasons. I was worried that this was something that I too might face. At the same time, I was reliving a scene from my past. When I was around the same age as you were then, I found myself in a similar position. My 2 older brothers and I had just moved from Baltimore to Columbia, Maryland. We decided to go to the mall. Before long, we realized a plainclothes police officer was following us from store to store.
So we'll end on that powerful cliffhanger of what happens to
That's
these
wonderful,
three.
Lauren.
Yeah, it is fantastic. It's really powerful what happens to these three boys, the Ralph boys, but it also, I think, brings us back to the beginning with Professor Gilliam talking about his two sons and trying to think about how to reckon this moment to young people, to children who have to grow up much too soon. So I would remind people that that's an animated video with the New York Times on the Torture Letters Project, Professor Ralph's most recent book that you can watch in full. So let's now turn to some questions because there's quite a few, and I'll have the team bring those up. How do we address the apparent power of police unions? Maybe we'll go to you, Professor Ralph.
Yeah, I mean, I think police unions have been a big force in preventing accountability for police officers. They raise a number of issues because even when a police chief, for example, wants to fire a police officer, sometimes the officer has recourse in the unions, which prevents that from happening. Other times, even if the officer is fired, then they can get a job in another agency or a unit of law enforcement. And so, and keep in mind, this is all happening as unions in general in American society have been gutted and dismantled. And so the police union, like the police, represent a privileged status in our society. And it's basically for the purpose of just protecting police officers and giving them the autonomy to do whatever they want without repercussions. And so I think there are some resources that we could use through the law to rectify this. But again, I think it's a question of political will. It's tied to the issue of how police officers maintain their authority. And we have to kind of dismantle the intricate webs as we advocate for radical change. Related to this is the issue of police misconduct payouts, which are usually handled by taxpayer money. And so even when police officers do something that is deemed wrong by the courts, it's the taxpayer that's handling this. And so we have to understand that we are implicated in police violence, all of us are, and we have to take systematic steps to dismantling them. And the union is at the heart of that.
Yeah, and it seems to me, if we think back to the Michael Brown and the Ferguson moment, a moment of awareness around the political economy of how this works. So out of that moment, we had the ways in which a threadbare, social welfare state was fining and, poor people to sort of keep itself barely afloat. Here, the political economy of taxpayers effectively paying police to have immunity abuse certain communities, I think, is coming to light, and there's a reckoning there coming as well. So, Professor Mullings or Gillian, did you want to weigh in on this question? We've got plenty more, if not.
No, I think his answer was fine.
All right.
Yeah,
let's go to the other question.
Yes.
What are your views regarding reparations, Professor Mullings?
Well, I think we are certainly due reparations. When one looks at the history, I think the movement for reparations is difficult but very strong, and it comes and goes at various times. I remember right after the UN conference on racism in 2001, the movement for reparations was very strong. And then 9/11 happened, and it died out. Now, I think that reparations is also important in examining history, in examining what this nation was built on. Most people have no idea about indigenous peoples losing their land, about the way in which Black people were enslaved and continue to be discriminated against. And I think it's very important to have those things come out. I think reparations has been enacted in many instances with the Japanese, the Germans, and I don't see what's so difficult about enacting reparations in the United States, except that people do not want to face history. And I think that is a main issue. And we really need to push on that. But I think we have to look at reparations not in a narrow way, but in a major way, so that in a broad way. So that, for example, when we look at reparations in higher education, we don't want to look at simply a few scholarships. We want to look at what the university has done in gentrifying the neighborhood, how they treat their workers, what they can do with incarcerated people, etc.
Professor Ralph, if I recall correctly, your recent work really comes out of reparations in Chicago, and it's related to a larger national or international conversation about reparations for slavery, but it actually also comes out of the local politics of the Chicago City Council and the like. Would you say a little bit about that?
Yes, I study a torture scandal that took place in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And there's been decades of trying to get acknowledgement for torture, which finally resulted in a 2015 reparations ordinance for torture survivors. And similar along the lines of what Leith was just describing, it not only provides individual resources for torture victims, but collective resources for the community in general. So there's a torture center where anyone who's impacted by police violence can go and get counseling. There are job training programs and educational resources for the community. And I think that's an important step. I think what a lesson that we learned from the reparation ordinance in Chicago is that it can't just be additive. And you'll notice when Leith was just describing what could be done in the realm of higher education, for example, it entailed a kind of reckoning with the institution's history. And I think there's a way in Chicago in which we can have a reparation ordinance and enact these changes, but still grow the police force at the same time. And I think we have to recognize that there has to be a reckoning that doesn't just give resources for the community to solve the problems as if they're past, and it's just a result of something that happened previously, but it has to be historically oriented with the realization that it could easily happen again. It can very easily happen again if we don't address the systemic root of the problem.
Professor Gillian, do you want to weigh in here, or we can go to other questions?
I'll just be real brief on this. The reparation should take place. And I think that we balk as a society and even as a government when we begin to talk about this issue. It's even become one of those issues that deeply divides us, but it shouldn't. Government has the resources to do this. We've seen this with the response with COVID, billions of dollars being able to be sent to American families. I think that we have the resources to make this happen, and we should. There's no real discussion about this, just our willingness to move forward.
Thank you. So let's go to the next question. What role can and should philanthropy play to address underlying causes of economic and racial injustice? Professor Gillian, we'll start with you.
Well, philanthropy can play a major role to help out with racial injustice in America in various ways. I mean, we can see this outside of politics, and then I'll go back to politics real quick. In terms of funding to Black colleges and universities, HBCUs, we can see this in terms of providing funds for private companies, Black banks, and Black companies and organizations. that can benefit individuals. But also when you look at government, I guess I see campaign contributions and donations as a form of philanthropy that allows for minority politicians, Black politicians in particular, to get their message out, to help their political campaigns, to allow them to get in office, to change the atmosphere, to make it more conducive for movements such as this, to make some headway, to bring about policy change. And so individuals can help not only with their actions, but also with their pocketbook, and they should.
Thank you. Lawrence, what would you say? What role, have you, all of us are engaged in working with philanthropy in ways big or small. What role do you think philanthropy can play in this moment in particular?
Yeah, I would echo the sentiments that Daniel just said. I think it can play a major role. I think that I think what we have to be cautious of as a society is succumbing to the idea that the government can abdicate their responsibility because philanthropy can solve social problems. And so I think we have to still hold our institutions accountable at the same time that we welcome philanthropy, of course. But when we allow the government to neglect its duty to serve the public because of the market and philanthropy, I think we sell ourselves short, particularly because in that instance, then the philanthropic organizations themselves have an outsized influence on the way that particular societal debates take shape. And so then it's not just the public's will on how we address climate change. It's the philanthropic organization who particularly cares about that issue to address that. But they might not have the resources or the kind of capacity to reach out to everyone who can help address the issue. And so if we really want to take the social issues and the social problems of our day seriously, we want everybody on board. We want all the resources that we can muster. And so it can't just be about allowing philanthropy to solve our problems. It has to be part of a wider a mandate through which all of our institutions are moving in the same direction to solve the problems that impact us all.
Thank you. Professor Mullins, do you want to reply to this one?
I completely agree with Lawrence, and I would just add that what I found in our studies in Latin America as well as in the US, that organizations have to be very careful. Philanthropy certainly has a role to play, but organizations have to be very careful about the way in which philanthropy might direct them, and whether it's the direction in which they want to go. And I think the best philanthropies are the ones that, in fact, let the organizations take the lead, let the people on the ground take the lead about how problems can be addressed.
Thanks. Let's go to the next question. How do you ensure voters from minority communities are not obstructed at the polls? Of course, we'll start with Dr. Gilliam on this one.
Well, this goes back to the question of public opinion that I wanted to address. And when we look at public opinion is a majority construct. So is actually voting. This is the reason why protests and social movements are so important, because they allow marginalized groups to have a voice. Now, about this question in particular, to ensure voters from minority communities are not obstructed at the polls, it requires individuals to stay vigilant and to use the channels of marginalized groups to express concerns. If there are abnormalities or problems at polls, let's say in Philadelphia or Minneapolis, the only way that we are informed of those issues is if the American people, if protesters, if voters themselves are hitting social media, informing their politicians, informing those individuals in power that there are inequities taking place and individuals need to address this. So we need to make sure that we call out injustices, and injustices can come in various forms, right? Long lines at polls that take you 5 hours need to be called down. Situations in which individuals are closing polls early or not having polls in specific minority communities need to be brought to light. But the first thing we need to do is inform politicians that it's taking place, and then we can move towards addressing the issue. I think for this particular election in 2020, we have to stay vigilant because we're likely going to be voting in an environment of a pandemic. And I think that that's going to cripple some of our normal means of engaging in the political process, even voting by mail, which has been a major discussion lately. And so if we see that there is particular inequities that will take place, we need to bring that to light.
Thank you. Leith or Lawrence, do you want to weigh in here?
Well, I would even strengthen what Daniel said. I would say that there is a conscious and well-organized attempt to bring us back to the days of the poll tax, particularly so that people of color cannot vote. And I believe the administration and others are fairly open about this. And we have all, and there are all kinds of means of doing it. There are all kinds of problems through social media. There's closing polls. There are all the things that were mentioned. And so I think we have to start with that they do not want us to vote. And we have to take every means possible to make sure we vote.
Thank you. So I'm mindful that our time, unfortunately, is coming short, but there's many questions. So let's take 3 more questions, and then I'll ask each of you to offer some quick responses. What role do educational institutions have in this movement? How can organizations support this movement? Next question. How do we fight misinformation? And the third, what is the best way to deal with white fragility? Okay, so we've got misinformation, the role of higher education institutions and organizations, which we've talked about a little bit, and the problem of white fragility. Lawrence, how do you want to weigh in on any or all of those?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the only way to deal with fragility, for instance, is to strengthen the resolve of those who are fragile. And so I think when I think of that, I think of the white person who sees a Black person in their space and calls the police on them or threatens to call the police on them. And I think that in the whole phenomenon of the viral video, that's calling that person out. And I think that may seem cruel. And I think that I don't agree that, that person should be criminalized. But I do think that calling that person out is an important political act that we can do as a public, because, that we've seen through the Floyd case that instance can turn violent and can turn deadly in a moment. And I think that, that is a way in which the white public has historically acted as the police or acted on behalf of the police. And it's an endangerment to public safety, actually. And so if we're rethinking the ways in which we need to protect all of our citizens and rethinking what a world might look like without enforcement, without the police to solve all of our issues, then we have to realize that policing each other is a big, huge part of the problem. And the impetus for that is a part of the problem as well. And so I would offer that, we need to continue to call out injustices when we see them.
I really appreciate your reframing of what often gets framed as sort of instances of popular culture or like acts that aren't thought about as significant political acts. And to think about these as political acts in the public sphere, I think is a very important reframing, as opposed to, it's just another viral video and the kids with their TikTok. Like, to think about these as acts of political actors, I think is a very important reframing. Leith and Daniel, do you want to weigh in on either of these three questions? Leith, to you first.
Well, I think they're important questions. The misinformation issue, I think, is quite problematic, particularly in the age of social media. I think educational institutions have a major role to play, as do scholars. And people who are interested in that, I'd suggest go to the website of Scholars for Social Justice, where we have a number of ideas and proposals about what people can do. But I think more than anything, what I would suggest is that people just really have to be active in this moment. I think one of my favorite quotes is from Gramsci. He describes an interregnum, and I think we are now in an interregnum. And he says, the crisis consists precisely of the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms, such as white fragility, appear. And I think that it's up to us to really steel ourselves to create the new.
Thank you. Daniel?
Just quickly on those points, and just building on what my colleagues have said and put forth some very important and interesting information. I think that if you look at the education system, it's very important to aid our discussions of race. I mean, we are training the next generation to understand these issues and to deal with these issues and to address them. And I think that's important. Misinformation is overcome through various means of, to be honest with you, social media, the ability to communicate with one another. I mean, it has its ills, but it has also the ability for us to forego the national news media that sometimes has its own narrative, to interact with one another on a personal level and to convey the right information to one another. And then finally, white fragility. I think that you got to ask yourselves, what are we going to choose? White sensibility or the reality of Black deaths in the Black community at the hands of police too often. The reality is that the emperor doesn't have any clothes. That is to say that in the Black community, we are suffering greatly. I mean, double-digit unemployment. We have problems with education inequity. I mean, just go down the list. Health disparities. That stuff needs to rise to the surface, and we need to address those concerns. And I think when our counterparts, and when we look at the white community and look at how they're addressing and examining these issues, I think if they are presented with the facts, the same way that they had, I don't know if I want to say a change of heart, but the same way they were able to look at the George Floyd video and say, this is wrong, will be the same way to look at any of the injustices taking place in the Black community. So as scholars, as everyday individuals, we should not hide or sugarcoat injustices that's taking place. Last point I'll make is that racial progress is always moving forward. And you can choose to walk behind it, you can choose to walk alongside of it, but it's forever moving.
Thank you for that. For my part, on the misinformation piece, I want to mention an SSRC project called MediaWell, which is at mediawell.ssrc.org, which brings together some of the leading scholars on misinformation and disinformation around several different topics. So there's review essays there and news aggregation and the like. So I'd point people to that. And then I want to take a moment, and I think that Lawrence and Daniel won't mind, to really acknowledge that I think the three of us would not have work without the work of Leif Mullings, who's a pioneering social scientist, a pioneering anthropologist. And, our tradition, our African-American tradition, tells me that I would be remiss if I did not pay tribute and honor to the path that you created that allows us to do work as social scientists. So thank you very much for that, Dr. Mullings. And with that, I want to thank Professor Daniel Gillian, Professor Lawrence Ralph, and Professor Leif Mullings for being with us, these distinguished Carnegie Fellows for taking time from their research, which helps us to understand the world in new and better ways, to share some insights on race and policing in the US and elsewhere today. Thank you very much.
Thank you
so much.
So thank you all for your time and for being here with us for this conversation. Thank you to everyone at the Carnegie Corporation, especially Carnegie Corporation President Vartan Gregorian, who over so many decades has been a man of extraordinary vision and who really had the vision for the Carnegie Fellows Program. And helped to make this forum possible. And of course, has been leading the way with the philanthropic support for social research in the social sciences and humanities, quite literally globally and quite literally for decades. So thank you to Vartan and thank you to the Carnegie Corporation. And thank all of you for joining us. Please visit carnegie.org to learn more about the Andrew Carnegie Fellows Program and future live stream events and to sign up for the Carnegie Corporation newsletter. Goodbye and thank you.